Now we have to add another visual effect, which is the damage to the spaceship after it hits the ground. We can see it in the final video, where there are some stains and scratches on the surface. In order to do that, we have to use two effects. A real displacement of the surface, because it would be really damaged after the impact. I also want to give the spaceship's material some noise and scratches. Let's start with the displace effect. But we don't want the displacement to be applied to the whole mesh, just to the part that hits the ground. We also need a mesh with a high resolution, since the displace modifier physically changes the object. So, let's open the Edit mode, turn on the Face Selection mode, and select all the faces you want. We need to add more faces now. So, press the right mouse button, and choose Subdivide from the menu that appears. The next step is to put these faces into a new group. So, when we apply the displacement modifier, it will only affect these faces, which correspond to these vertices. Open the Vertex Group tab, add a new group, and rename it however you like. Leave the Edit mode and add the Displace modifier. Select the new group you just made in the Vertex Group property. Now we need to create a texture, so we can change how the displacement works. The Displace modifier actually changes the shape of a mesh, based on the texture we make. And the displace effect is added based on the gray values of this map. So, add a new texture and click here to change it. I'm going to choose a preset for this texture, clouds in this case. We want a map with a lot of contrast, so that the mesh can be deformed with a lot of small bumps. We have a lot of noise distributions to choose from. I usually use the Voronoi F2F1. Then, we can change the size of the noise using the size parameter. If we go back to the modifier properties, we can now change the strength property depending on the final effect we want. But it looks like the mesh doesn't change at all. This is because I forgot to assign the vertex group we created earlier. So, all we need to do is go into Edit mode, and click Assign to the group we made. In this way, the new group is assigned to the selected vertices. Now we can see what happened. Now, bring down the value of strength. But we often have some flaws along the edges. They look like they touch each other. We can avoid some of this by changing the mid-level property. But keep in mind that the final result depends heavily on the resolution of the mesh. So, the more faces, the better the result. You have to find the right balance between the effect's quality, its complexity, and the amount of memory it requires. You can now change the way the texture looks. We can also choose the hard value if we want to make the contrast stronger. Also, we can turn on the color ramp option. In this way, we can change how the map's grayscale is spread out. So, we now have a damaged spaceship. But we want to animate this damage, since it changes during the impact. So, the strength property needs to be animated. Move to the frame when the spaceship hits the ground, and add a new keyframe to the strength property. And here we can add a new keyframe. Remember that to add a new keyframe, move the mouse over the property you want and press the I key. The value must be 0 in the first keyframe. So, as the spaceship moves across the floor, the effect gets stronger. Now we want to add some damage to the texture, as you can see here. And, just like we've done before, we want to make this animate. The first step is to get some scratched and dirty textures. They're easy to find on the web. We need to open the shading pane now. Here is the material itself, with its basic textures. Now, I'll add scratches and dirt to the base color to give it a rough look. They are masks with black and white colors. We can use this to our advantage, so that the white areas are transparent, and only the black spots are visible. We can do that by combining the textures using the multiply fusion method. The Node Wrangler add-on is the easiest way to add a texture. Open the Related tab on the right, and click Add Texture Setup. Before you do this, you must also choose the Principled Shader node. This adds the texture and the related mapping nodes automatically. Disconnect the nodes from the Principled Shader, and then open the texture you want. We can also see a preview of the texture by pressing Ctrl, Shift, and then clicking on the node we want to see. Again, this is a shortcut for the Node Wrangler add-on, so make sure you have it installed. And it should in Blender's most recent versions. We can choose how to use the texture in the Texture Coordinate node. It usually uses UV coordinates. But you might not have the UV coordinates in some situations. So, switching to object mode can be helpful. In this case, it is also useful to choose the box option in the texture node. In this way, the texture is projected onto the mesh from a 3D box, and this lets a regular projection be made on the whole object. Then, you have to change the scale of the map's coordinates to get the size you want. Now we have to combine this map with the texture of the base color. So, connect the two textures with a Mix RGB node. Join the output to the base color of the Principled Shader. Then I'll change the mode of blending to multiply. This way, we can clearly see the scratches on top of the original texture. Now we have to do the same steps for the other texture. In this case, we need to mix this texture with the previous mix node. This is the final result. We can add some depth as the last step by adding a bump map. This material already has a bump map, but we can add another one using the dirt textures. First, we have to mix the two textures together again. And the result will be the bump map. In fact, a bump map is just a grayscale map, where the gray values are used to simulate an optical displacement of the surface. So, to mix the two textures, we need to add a new mix node and use the multiply method. And this is the end result. We can now get rid of the original normal map node and replace it with the bump node. Then we have to connect the map we made to the height input value. The last step is to connect the bump node to the shader's normal input. The bump map's effect can be seen clearly in the rendered image. The surface looks rougher and more real. As a last step, we could animate this effect. So, we need to animate the strength value of the bump node and the mixing factor in the textures we added before. We'll do that in the same frames where the displace effect was animated. But if we lower the mixing factor to 0, we don't see the original texture, just the ones we added as dirt. This is because the input values have to be switched in the mix nodes. Now, add new keyframes for each value and set them to 0. Move on to the next frame and add a new keyframe. This is what happened in the end. As the spacecraft moves along the ground, it damages the surface more and more. Now we have to move on to the explosion of the glass structure at the top of the building, and the destruction of the part of the building below. This is our Blender file. The object is a single mesh right now. So we have to separate the sphere. Go to the edit mode, move the mouse over the sphere, and then press the L key. This lets you choose all the faces that are linked together. You need to do the same thing for the wireframe structure that goes around the sphere. This is a nice way to choose parts of a mesh that are connected to each other. Then, press the P key to split the selection apart. But if we move the sphere, the object below has to have a concave shape in place of the sphere. We can do that using the Boolean modifier. First, follow the same steps as before to separate this upper part of the building. Now, select this object and choose Boolean from the Modifiers tab. Pick the sphere as the object to target. The last step is to choose Self-Intersection. You can also apply the modifier. We can now move on to destroying the sphere. When we want to break something, we have to first break it up into the parts we want. I mean that when we have to deal with simulations like collisions or explosions, and we want an object to break into many pieces, we can't just let Blender decide how to break the object. This is possible when we use a particle system to explode an object, like we did in the previous lessons. But if we want the pieces to be real objects and not just particles, we have to go another way. We basically have to decide how many pieces we want before we break the object. The Cell Fracture add-on is the easiest way to do that. But before we can do that, we need to separate the objects again. I want to split the sphere from the wireframe structure. The steps are exactly the same as last time. Before we break the sphere into pieces, there is one more thing we need to do. At the moment, the sphere is a completely full object. We need to add some thickness to the sphere, so that when it breaks, the pieces look like glass or walls. So, let's add the solidify modifier. We can set the thickness and direction. I want the thickness to be inside the sphere. Now we can finally use the cell fracture effect. The cell fracture method works by adding some points to the object that show where it needs to be broken. Each point marks the center of each piece. And we can set this point cloud in the point source section. We can just leave onverts in our case. Source limit specifies the maximum number of points that can be added. A recursive fracture can also be added. But for now, we can leave it at 1. We don't have to change the other options. But it's important to choose a collection where we want all the pieces to go. When we press OK, Blender breaks the object into many pieces and moves them into the collection we made. You also have to turn off the original sphere, or it will be rendered along with the new one. So, we have a lot of pieces, and each of them has a surface thickness, which we talked about before. When the sphere breaks, we'll get these pieces. If we want more pieces or a different way to put them together, we can delete this collection and start the process over again. Last, we need to do the same thing with the wireframe structure. In addition to the sphere, I will explode the upper portion of the building as well. We also have the option of using the cell fracture effect to break it. In this particular instance, though, I find that manually breaking the object into several pieces gives me a higher level of control. Therefore, I switch to the edit mode and choose the parts that I want to break apart. Once we have all of the pieces, there is one more critical step that must be completed, and that is returning the object's center of mass to its origin. Otherwise, the center would be the same as the actual building, and this would have a significant impact on the rigid body simulation that we have to perform in a moment. Additionally, we need to remove the collision physical effect from all of the individual pieces. This is the effect that we added to the building, but we do not require it any longer. In the following lesson, we will investigate how to implement the rigid body simulation into the individual components of the sphere and the structure.